Welcome to the Burrawan branch. This is the first in an occasional series of scratch building tips and tricks that I have learned, adapted or developed myself. As with most facets of this hobby, there are multiple ways of approaching projects, and individual modelers find ways that work best for them. I offer these tips in that vein. They have worked for me, and they may work for you, particularly if you are still searching for a method with which you feel comfortable. My aim is to keep these videos short and focused on just one technique per episode. Let's get started. In this video, I demonstrate how I fade painted corrugated metal siding. Why paint fading on, as we so often do when weathering, when the existing paint can be made to look faded and more naturally so? In other words, as in the real world, the painted cladding is assaulted by agents that remove or modify the colour coat. I used this technique when building the goods shed at Tarrawangan. Briefly, the only material used in this process is isopropyl alcohol. For convenience, I will call it IPA from now on. The tools consist of a couple of small brushes. It also helps if prototype photos are available, but they're not essential. The corrugated metal was prepared and painted as for any project, and that is not demonstrated here. Briefly, it was first sprayed with undercoat, then matte clear. The matte clear protects the undercoat from the fading process. A colour coat of light grey acrylic was then applied and left for 24 hours to dry and cure. The fading process involves brushing IPA onto individual sheets. The IPA softens the paint of the colour coat so that when brushed with a dry, firm bristled brush, some of the paint's tints are removed or redistributed to produce a faded effect. The underlying colour coat reduces the likelihood that the IPA will cut through the undercoat to the bare metal. We certainly don't want that. Different amounts of IPA are applied to each panel. Note the IPA is not replenished every time a new panel is brushed. Occasionally, a panel is reworked with the IPA or the dry brush to get more variation across that panel. You can see that some of the paint is removed where the brush hits the workboard, but most of the paint is just being redistributed on the siding. Sometimes I use the residual IPA that's on the dry brush to very lightly affect the paint on a panel, either removing a bit more or adding some of the pigment already on the brush. The brush hasn't been dipped in IPA for quite some time here, but it's still got sufficient on it to re-soften already softened paint a bit more. Now we're putting quite large amounts of IPA onto these sections and repeating applications in some places, just to break up any uniformity. Note that I always brush the IPA downwards to prevent the IPA getting under the overlaps and weakening or dissolving the contact adhesive. Just keep working at the paint until satisfied with the result. The more it's worked, the greater the variation within individual panels and between panels. Variation in tone and extent can be achieved by using different amounts of IPA, varying how long it sits on the paint, how hard the softened paint is rubbed, and how much of each sheet is exposed to the process. You can see that a little of the grey is being distributed onto the timber trims. That breaks up the uniformity of the colour code on the trims. The light grey paint has a blue base, which doesn't seem to come away as much as the lighter tints in it. I think the result looks quite like old-style galvanised metal. Let's recap on the key elements of the process. First, brush IPA onto individual panels. Allow it to sit on the paint for a few seconds or more, then rub each panel with a dry, stiff brush. Revisit some panels with more IPA and the dry brush to increase variation within and between panels. Repeat the process until the desired result is achieved. Thanks for watching. Happy modelling.